I always believed that truth was stronger than lies, that innocence would always find a way to shine through darkness, that good people, if they did nothing wrong, would be protected by that simple fact. I was wrong. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was sitting in a small classroom in a language institute on the outskirts of Amsterdam, trying to focus on verb conjugations, while my mind wandered to the errands I needed to run after class. The room smelled like coffee and old textbooks. Sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, creating stripes across the wooden desks. There were only 3 of us that morning: me, a middle-aged man trying to improve my Dutch for work, and 2 others who'd become something like friends over the past few months. One of them was Henrik, a young man from Denmark who'd moved to the Netherlands for a fresh start. He was 24, with kind eyes and an easy smile that made everyone feel comfortable. He worked part-time at a bookshop and talked about opening his own cafe someday. The other was Amara, a woman from Belgium who was always punctual, always prepared, always ready with a joke to lighten the mood when grammar exercises became too tedious. We weren't close in the traditional sense. We didn't see each other outside of class. But there was a quiet camaraderie between us, the kind that forms when people share the small struggle of learning something new together, twice a week in a room that smelled like old wood and hope. That morning, I'd brought my daughter with me. Her name is Lotte, and she'd just turned 2 years old a few weeks earlier. My wife had an important meeting she couldn't reschedule, and the childcare arrangements fell through at the last minute. I called the instructor, explained the situation, and she kindly allowed me to bring Lotte along, just this once. I promised she'd be quiet. I promised she wouldn't disturb anyone, and she wasn't. She sat in the corner with her coloring books and stuffed rabbit, humming softly to herself, completely absorbed in her own little world. Occasionally she'd look up at me and smile, and I'd smile back, relieved that she was being so well behaved. During the mid-morning break, we all stepped outside into the small courtyard behind the building. The air was cool and fresh. Lotte immediately brightened, running toward the patch of grass near the benches, her little shoes making soft tapping sounds against the pavement. Henrik and Amara were chatting by the vending machine. I was checking my phone, half listening to their conversation about weekend plans. Then Lotte ran up to Henrik. She'd seen him smile at her earlier, and in the way that children do, she'd decided he was a friend. She looked up at him with those big, curious eyes, clutching her stuffed rabbit under one arm. Henrik knelt down to her level, the way adults do when they want to show a child respect and kindness. He said something gentle. I don't even remember what, and she giggled. Then, without warning, without hesitation, she leaned forward and planted a quick, innocent kiss right on his lips. Everyone laughed. It was the kind of pure, spontaneous moment that makes you forget, for just a second, that the world can be cruel. Amara smiled and said something about how children have no filters. I chuckled and apologized, explaining that Lotte did that sometimes. She was affectionate, trusting, completely unaware of social boundaries. Henrik just grinned, patted her head gently, and told me it was fine. He seemed touched even. He said it reminded him of his niece back in Copenhagen. The moment lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then the break ended and we all went back inside. Lotte returned to her coloring books. I returned to my verb conjugations. Henrik returned to his notes. I didn't see the phone. I didn't see the person recording from across the courtyard. I didn't know that those 10 seconds, those innocent, harmless 10 seconds, had just been captured and were about to be uploaded into a world that doesn't forgive, doesn't pause, and doesn't care about context. By the time class ended 2 hours later, the video had already been shared 43 times. How do you protect someone when the whole world has already decided they're guilty? I didn't find out about the video until the next morning. I was at work, sitting in my cubicle responding to emails about quarterly reports and budget allocations. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Amara. Have you seen this? I think we need to talk. She sent me a link. I clicked it without thinking much of it, assuming it was something funny or a news article she wanted to share. The page loaded slowly. Then I saw it. The thumbnail showed Henrik kneeling in the courtyard. The headline above it read, "Man caught kissing toddler in shocking footage." My stomach dropped. I watched the video. It was edited, cropped. The person who filmed it had cut out everything except the moment Lotte kissed Henrik. You couldn't see her run up to him. You couldn't hear the laughter. You couldn't see me standing just a few feet away. All you could see was a grown man kneeling down and a small child's face moving toward his. The way it was framed, the way it was cut, it looked like he'd initiated it. It looked wrong. The comments beneath the video were already vicious. Hundreds of them, pouring in every minute. People calling him a predator, demanding he be arrested, saying things I can't even repeat here. My hands started shaking. I tried to scroll through the comments to find someone, anyone, who questioned the video, who asked for context, who hesitated before passing judgment. I found none. I called Amara immediately. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was tight, strained. She'd seen the video hours earlier and had been trying to figure out what to do. She told me it had already been shared on multiple platforms: Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Instagram. It was spreading faster than either of us could comprehend. She'd tried commenting on a few posts, explaining what really happened, but her comments were either ignored or attacked. People accused her of defending a criminal. Some even sent her threatening messages. I hung up and tried calling Henrik. It went straight to voicemail. I called again and again. Nothing. I sent him a text. "Henrik, please call me. We need to talk about the video. This is a misunderstanding. We'll fix this." I stared at my phone, waiting for the 3 dots that would indicate he was typing back. They never appeared. I left work early that day. I couldn't focus, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except refresh the video page over and over, watching the view count climb higher and higher. By the time I got home, it had reached over 2 million views. 2 million people who now believed they knew exactly who Henrik was, what he'd done, and what he deserved. That evening, I sat down with my wife and showed her the video. She went pale. She remembered that day, remembered me telling her about the sweet moment during the break. She covered her mouth with her hand and whispered, "Oh my God, they're destroying him." I nodded. I didn't know what else to say. We both sat there in silence, the glow of the screen reflecting off our faces, as the comments continued to multiply. Strangers from across the world, united in their certainty, their rage, their conviction that they were on the side of justice. Later that night, I tried calling Henrik again. This time, someone answered. But it wasn't Henrik. It was a voice I didn't recognize, tired, older, cautious. It turned out to be his father. He asked who I was, and I explained. There was a long pause. Then he told me Henrik had shut off his phone, that reporters had shown up at his apartment, that his son was terrified, hiding, unable to eat or sleep. His father's voice cracked when he said, "He didn't do anything wrong. You know that, don't you?" I told him I did. I told him I would do everything I could to fix this. But even as I said the words, I felt the weight of their emptiness. How do you fight a wildfire when the whole world is holding a match? By the 3rd day, Henrik's name and face were everywhere. News websites picked up the story. Bloggers dissected the video frame by frame, analyzing his body language, his expression, constructing narratives from shadows and assumptions. A hashtag trended globally. Justice for her. People changed their profile pictures to solidarity images. Petitions were created demanding his arrest. Some called for worse. I watched it all unfold from behind my screen, helpless and horrified. I tried reaching out to the platforms hosting the video, reporting it for being misleading and edited. I explained the context in every report I filed. I got automated responses. Nothing changed. The video remained. The comments remained. The hatred remained. Amara and I tried coordinating a response. We drafted statements explaining what really happened, posted them in as many places as we could find. We tagged journalists, influencers, anyone with a large following who might listen. Some ignored us. Others accused us of being complicit. One person replied saying that even if the context was different, it didn't matter. Henrik should have known better than to be in that situation in the first place. As if kindness itself had become a crime. I went to the Language Institute to speak with the instructor, hoping she might issue a public statement or provide some institutional support. She listened to me with a pained expression, wringing her hands. Then she told me that the school's board had advised her to stay silent. They were worried about backlash, worried about their reputation, worried about enrollment numbers. She apologized but said there was nothing she could do. I left that office feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. My wife and I talked late into the night, trying to figure out our next move. She suggested we contact a lawyer. I agreed, but I also knew that lawsuits take time, and time was something Henrik didn't have. Every hour that passed, the narrative solidified. Every share, every comment, every angry post added another layer of cement to the story the world had decided was true. I barely slept that week. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Henrik's face in the courtyard, smiling down at my daughter. I replayed the moment over and over, searching for something, anything, I could have done differently. Should I have stepped in sooner? Should I have been more careful about where we took our break? Should I have anticipated that someone would twist an innocent moment into something monstrous? But how could I have known? How could any of us have known that a 2-year-old's kiss would become a weapon? One evening I was scrolling through my social media feed when I saw a post from someone I'd gone to university with. She'd shared the video with a caption that read, "This is why we need to protect our children. Monsters are everywhere." I stared at her words. We'd sat next to each other in lectures. We'd studied together for exams. She had no idea I was connected to this story, but seeing her share it, seeing someone I knew personally contribute to the wildfire, made it all feel unbearably close. I wanted to comment. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, but I didn't. I closed the app and put my phone face down on the table. I realized then that this wasn't just about Henrik anymore. It was about all of us, about how quickly we're willing to believe the worst, about how satisfying it feels to be part of a mob, to point fingers, to feel righteous and certain. I wondered if Henrik was watching the same things I was. I wondered if he'd seen the calls for violence. I wondered if he was still alive. How do you convince the world to listen when it's already made up its mind? On the 5th day, I found out where Henrik was hiding. His father called me early in the morning, his voice barely above a whisper. He told me Henrik had left his apartment in the middle of the night and taken a train to a small town outside Utrecht, where an old friend from university had offered him a place to stay. His father gave me the address. He also told me Henrik wasn't answering anyone's calls, that he'd locked himself in a room and refused to come out, that he'd stopped eating. I told my wife I needed to go. She hesitated, worried about what might happen if someone recognized me, if someone connected me to the story. But she also knew I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. She kissed me on the forehead and made me promise to be careful. I promised. The drive took just over an hour. The town was quiet, almost eerily so, with narrow streets lined with old brick houses and small gardens. I parked outside the address Henrik's father had given me and sat there for a moment, trying to figure out what I was going to say. How do you comfort someone whose life has been destroyed by a lie? I knocked on the door. A man in his 30s answered. Henrik's friend, I assumed. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. I introduced myself, and his expression softened slightly. He let me in without a word and led me upstairs to a small bedroom at the end of a narrow hallway. He knocked gently on the door and said, "Henrik, someone's here to see you." Silence. I stepped closer and spoke through the door. I told him it was me. I told him I was sorry. I told him I wanted to help. There was a long pause, and then I heard the sound of a lock turning. The door opened just a crack. Henrik's face appeared in the dim light. He looked like a different person. His eyes were hollow, red-rimmed. His skin was pale. He'd lost weight. He stared at me for a moment, and then his face crumpled. He started crying. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The room was small and dark, the curtains drawn. There was a mattress on the floor with a single blanket, a glass of water on the windowsill, and nothing else. Henrik sat down on the edge of the mattress and buried his face in his hands. I sat down beside him and didn't say anything. I just sat there, listening to him cry, feeling the weight of everything that had been taken from him. After a while he spoke. His voice was hoarse, broken. He said he didn't understand. He said he'd been kind. He said he'd done nothing wrong. He said he kept replaying that moment in the courtyard, trying to figure out what he could have done differently, but there was nothing. He'd just been kind to a child, and now the world wanted him dead. He told me he'd seen the messages, the death threats. The pictures people had made of him with targets over his face. He told me someone had found his address and posted it online, that his landlord had called him, terrified, begging him to leave because journalists were camped outside the building. He told me he'd been fired from his job at the bookshop without explanation, that old friends had blocked him on social media, that even his own mother had called, crying, asking him if the video was real, if he'd really done something terrible. I tried to tell him that people would see the truth eventually, that the video was edited, that we'd find a way to prove his innocence. But even as I said the words, I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed me either. He looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, somewhere between desperation and resignation, and asked, "What if they never stop? What if this is my life now?" I didn't have an answer. I just sat there, feeling the crushing weight of everything we couldn't control. What do you say to someone when the truth isn't enough? I stayed with Henrik for the rest of that day and most of the next. His friend brought us food, though Henrik barely touched it. We talked sometimes. Other times we just sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the street outside. Children playing, cars passing, life continuing as if nothing had changed. For Henrik, everything had changed. At some point, I convinced him to let me see his phone. He'd been checking it obsessively, scrolling through the comments and articles, torturing himself with every new piece of hatred. I took it from him and went through everything. The messages were worse than I'd imagined. Graphic threats, photoshopped images. People had found his social media profiles, his family members, his old schoolmates. They dug up photos from years ago and reinterpreted them through the lens of the current narrative. A picture of him at a park was labeled as evidence he was stalking children. A selfie with his niece was called disturbing. Every piece of his life had been weaponized. I found the original video again, the unedited version, on a backup file Henrik's friend had saved before it disappeared from the internet. Watching it again, I felt a surge of anger so intense I had to set the phone down and step outside for a moment. The full video showed everything. Lotta running up, Henrik kneeling, her kissing him, me standing right there, everyone laughing. It was so obviously innocent, so clearly harmless, that it made the edited version feel even more evil. I asked Henrik if he'd tried sharing the unedited footage. He shook his head. He said he'd thought about it, but his friend had advised against it. They were worried it would only make things worse, that people would accuse him of fabricating evidence, or that the mob would find new ways to twist even the full video into something sinister. I understood the fear, but I also knew that staying silent wasn't working either. We decided together that we had to do something. We couldn't just wait for the storm to pass. The storm wasn't passing. If anything, it was getting worse. New posts appeared daily, new hashtags, new calls for action. Someone had started a crowdfunding campaign to hire a private investigator to find more victims. The campaign had raised over 50,000 euros in 3 days. Henrik was scared, terrified actually. But he was also exhausted. He told me he couldn't keep living like this, hiding, afraid to even look out a window, jumping at every sound. He said he'd thought about ending it all, just disappearing, just making the noise stop. I grabbed his shoulders and made him look at me. I told him that wasn't an option, that we were going to fight this, that we were going to show the world the truth, even if it meant putting ourselves in the line of fire. He asked me why I was doing this, why I was risking so much for him. I told him the truth, because it could have been anyone. Because if we let this happen to him, we're saying it's okay for it to happen to anyone. Because silence in the face of injustice is just another form of violence. We spent the next several hours strategizing. We decided to release the full video publicly, along with written statements from me, Amara, and Henrik's friend who'd been there that day. We'd post it everywhere we could think of. We'd tag journalists, influencers, human rights organizations. We'd make it impossible to ignore. But we also knew that releasing the video wouldn't be enough on its own. We needed someone with a platform, someone with credibility, to amplify it. I reached out to a journalist I'd once worked with on a minor project years ago. I explained the situation and asked if she'd be willing to cover it. She was hesitant. She told me stories like this were complicated, that her editors might not approve, that there was always a risk of backlash. But she also said she'd think about it. That night, before I left to drive back home, Henrik walked me to the door. He looked a little less broken than he had when I'd arrived. Not hopeful exactly, but something close to it. He thanked me. I told him not to thank me yet. We hadn't won anything. We hadn't fixed anything. All we'd done was decide to fight. But sometimes deciding to fight is the hardest part. Can one truth undo 1,000 lies? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss the next one. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can even buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every little bit helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's get back to it. We released the full video on a Saturday morning. I posted it on every platform I had access to, along with a detailed written account of what had happened that day in the courtyard. Amara did the same. Henrik's friend did the same. We tagged news organizations, advocacy groups, anyone we thought might help spread the truth. Then we waited. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The posts got a handful of likes, a few shares, but nothing significant. I started to feel a creeping sense of dread. What if the truth didn't matter? What if people were so invested in the narrative they'd built that they refused to let it go? Then, around midday, something shifted. The journalist I'd reached out to, her name was Ineki, published an article. It was titled, "The Danger of Viral Judgment: How an Innocent Moment Was Weaponized." She included the full video, statements from all of us, and a thoughtful analysis of how the edited version had been used to manipulate public perception. Her article was shared by a few prominent figures on social media. Those shares led to more shares. By evening, it was trending. The response was complicated. Some people immediately apologized. They admitted they'd rushed to judgment, that they'd been wrong, that they should have questioned the original video before sharing it. Those responses gave me a flicker of hope. But they were outnumbered by the people who doubled down. They accused us of lying. They said the full video was fake, that we'd staged it after the fact to cover for Henrik. They said even if it was real, it didn't change anything, that Henrik should have been more careful, that he shouldn't have put himself in that position, that adults shouldn't interact with children they don't know. Period. Some of the most vicious responses came from people who claimed to be protecting children. They said that releasing the full video was re-victimizing my daughter, that we were exploiting her innocence to defend a predator. It didn't matter that Lotta was my child, that she'd initiated the kiss, that I was right there the entire time. They needed a villain, and Henrik had already been cast in that role. Henrik called me late that night. His voice was shaking. He'd been reading the responses, and while he was grateful for the people who'd believed him, he was devastated by the ones who hadn't. He said it felt like no matter what we did, no matter how much evidence we provided, there would always be people who refused to see him as anything other than a monster. I didn't disagree. I'd been thinking the same thing, but I also reminded him that the truth was out there now, that people who cared about facts, who cared about fairness, would see it, that the world wasn't just made up of the loudest voices. There were quiet ones too, thoughtful ones, ones that took time to listen. He didn't sound convinced, but he thanked me anyway. Over the next few days, more journalists picked up the story. Some were sympathetic, focusing on the dangers of misinformation and mob justice. Others were more skeptical, framing it as a cautionary tale about the complexities of online discourse, but stopping short of fully exonerating Henrik. A few still treated him as guilty, claiming that the full video didn't provide enough context, or that his body language was still questionable. Amara and I did a few interviews together, trying to explain what had happened from the perspective of people who'd actually been there. The interviewers were polite, but I could sense their hesitation. They didn't want to be seen as defending someone the internet had already convicted. They didn't want to be the next target. I understood. Fear is contagious. One evening, my wife and I were sitting on the couch, exhausted from the constant vigilance, the constant checking of notifications, the constant bracing for the next wave of backlash. She turned to me and asked, "Do you think this will ever really be over for him?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that truth would eventually win, that Henrik's name would be cleared, that he'd be able to return to a normal life. But I couldn't say it, because I knew deep down that the internet doesn't forget. That even if 1 million people learned the truth, there would still be thousands who didn't. That Henrik's face would always be associated with that video. That any time someone Googled his name, that edited clip would appear alongside the full one, and people would have to choose which version to believe. And not everyone would choose correctly. How do you rebuild a life when the world has already buried you? Weeks passed. The story gradually faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals, fresher outrage. But for Henrik, nothing faded. He stayed in that small town outside Utrecht, afraid to return to his apartment in Amsterdam. His landlord had terminated his lease. His job was gone. His savings were running out. The bookshop where he'd worked wouldn't even respond to his emails asking for a reference. I visited him several more times during that period. Each time I found him a little more withdrawn, a little quieter. He'd stopped checking his phone as obsessively, but only because he'd stopped hoping for anything good to come from it. He spent most of his days reading or staring out the window. His friend told me he barely spoke anymore, that some days he didn't even leave the room. One afternoon, I arrived to find Henrik sitting on the front steps of the house, smoking a cigarette. I didn't know he smoked. He told me he'd started a week ago, that it gave him something to do with his hands. We sat there together in silence for a while, watching the street. A few children rode by on bicycles, laughing. Henrik watched them with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe, or longing, or resignation. He told me he'd been thinking about leaving the country, starting over somewhere far away where no one knew his face or his name. Maybe Spain, he said, or Portugal. Somewhere warm, somewhere he could disappear. I asked him if he really wanted to spend the rest of his life running. He didn't answer. Around that time, I started noticing changes in my own life too. Some of my colleagues at work had figured out that I was connected to the story. A few asked me about it directly, others just avoided me. One person I'd considered a friend pulled me aside one day and told me gently but firmly that I should be careful about associating myself with situations like this. When I asked what she meant, she said that even if Henrik was innocent, being linked to him could damage my reputation, that people might start to wonder about me too. I felt a cold anger rise in my chest. I wanted to tell her that if caring about the truth damaged my reputation, then maybe my reputation wasn't worth protecting. But I didn't. I just nodded and walked away. My wife noticed the change in me. She said I'd become quieter, more distant, that I snapped at small things I used to ignore. She was right. I was carrying a weight I didn't know how to put down. Every time I looked at Lotta, I felt a mixture of love and guilt. Love because she was the most innocent, pure thing in my life. Guilt because her innocence had been weaponized to destroy someone else. One evening, after Lotta had gone to bed, my wife asked me if I regretted bringing her to class that day. I thought about the question for a long time. Did I regret it? If I could go back, knowing what would happen, would I choose differently? I told her I didn't know, that it felt impossible to regret something that had been so ordinary, so harmless in the moment. But I also couldn't ignore the consequences. I couldn't ignore what it had cost Henrik. She held my hand and told me it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have predicted what someone else would do with that moment, that the person who filmed and edited the video was to blame, that the people who shared it without questioning it were to blame, that the system that allows misinformation to spread faster than truth was to blame. She told me I'd done everything I could to make it right. I wanted to believe her, but belief is harder when you're drowning. Ineki, the journalist who'd written the article, reached out to me one more time. She said she'd received messages from people who wanted to help Henrik. Some had offered money. Others had offered job leads. A few had even offered legal support to go after the person who'd created the edited video. I passed the information along to Henrik. He seemed grateful but also skeptical. He told me he'd learned not to trust hope. I didn't blame him. When does seeking justice become just another way of seeking revenge? 2 months after the video first went viral, Henrik decided to come out of hiding. Not because things had gotten better, not because he felt safe, but because, as he told me, he couldn't keep living like a ghost. He returned to Amsterdam and moved into a small studio apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't much, but it was his. He found work at a warehouse, unloading shipments in the early mornings. It was hard, physical labor, far from the bookshop he'd loved, but it was something. It was survival. I met him for coffee one Saturday afternoon at a quiet cafe far from the center of the city. He looked older, thinner. There were lines on his face that hadn't been there before. We talked about small things at first: the weather, the coffee, the noise of the city. Then, eventually, we talked about what mattered. He told me he'd accepted that his old life was gone, that he'd never work in a bookshop again, that he'd never open that cafe he used to dream about, that any time he met someone new, there would always be the fear that they'd recognize him, that they'd Google his name and find the video. He said he'd learned to live with the fear, but he hadn't learned to forgive. I asked him who he couldn't forgive: the person who filmed the video, the people who shared it, the world. He shook his head. He said he couldn't forgive himself for being naive enough to think kindness was safe, for believing that innocence was enough, for not protecting himself better. I told him that wasn't fair, that he hadn't done anything wrong. He smiled, but it was a sad, tired smile. He said he knew that, intellectually, but knowing something and feeling it were two different things. And he still felt like he'd lost something fundamental, some part of himself he'd never get back. We finished our coffee in silence. As we stood to leave, he thanked me again, for visiting him, for believing him, for not walking away. I told him I wished I could have done more. He shrugged. He said most people had done nothing at all. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to normal life. I went back to work, focused on my family, tried to put the whole ordeal behind me, but I found I couldn't. Every time I saw a viral video, every time I saw people sharing something with absolute certainty, every time I watched the internet turn someone into a villain overnight, I thought of Henrik. I thought of how easy it is to destroy a life, how little it takes, how eager we are to believe the worst. One night, I was scrolling through social media when I came across a new video. A young woman had been filmed in a grocery store yelling at an employee. The clip was short, out of context, and spreading fast. The comments were already filling with judgment, with assumptions, with calls for her to be identified and fired. I felt sick. I wanted to comment, to tell people to wait, to ask for context, to remember Henrik. But I didn't. I just closed the app and sat there, staring at the dark screen. My wife asked me what was wrong. I told her I was tired. Tired of the noise. Tired of the speed. Tired of living in a world where a 10-second video can ruin a life. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand on mine and sat with me in the silence. A few weeks later, Iniki reached out to tell me she was working on a follow-up piece. She wanted to interview Henrik again, to see how he was doing, to explore the long-term effects of viral misinformation. I asked Henrik if he was willing. He hesitated. Then he said yes. He said if his story could help one person think twice before sharing something, then maybe it had been worth it. I wasn't sure I believed that, but I admired him for trying. We met at Inik's office for the interview. Henrik was nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he answered her questions. She asked him what he wanted people to understand. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "I want them to understand that I was real, that I had a life, that I had dreams, and that all of it could have been avoided if people had just paused, if they'd just asked one question before they hit share." Iniki's article was published a week later. It was thoughtful, compassionate, well-researched. It was shared a few thousand times. It was not enough to undo the damage, but it was something. How many lives do we destroy before we learn to wait for the truth? It's been over a year now since that morning in the courtyard. Lotta is 3 years old. She doesn't remember the video, doesn't understand what happened, doesn't know that a moment of her innocent affection became a weapon. I'm grateful for that. I hope she never has to know. Henrik still lives in Amsterdam. He still works at the warehouse. He started seeing a therapist, trying to process everything that happened, trying to rebuild some sense of self. He told me recently that he's thought about changing his name, legally erasing the identity that's now tied to so much pain. He hasn't decided yet. Part of him wants to reclaim his name. Part of him wants to let it go. We still meet for coffee sometimes. Not as often as we used to, but enough. We don't talk about the video much anymore. There's only so many times you can revisit a wound before it stops healing and just becomes a scar. Instead, we talk about books, about the weather, about small ordinary things that used to make up a life. Amara moved to Brussels last spring. She said she needed a fresh start, needed to be around people who didn't know the story, who wouldn't look at her with questions in their eyes. We still exchange messages occasionally. She seems happier now. I'm glad. As for me, I've changed too. I'm more cautious now about what I share online, more skeptical of viral narratives, more aware of how quickly truth can be twisted into something unrecognizable. I think twice before I click share. I ask questions before I pass judgment. I try to remember Henrik's face in the courtyard, kind, open, innocent, before the world decided who he was. But I also carry a sadness I didn't have before. A sadness that comes from knowing how fragile justice is, how easily it can be drowned out by noise, how willing we are to sacrifice truth for the satisfaction of outrage. The person who filmed and edited the original video was never identified. They vanished into the anonymity of the internet, leaving behind the destruction they'd caused without ever facing consequences. There's no closure in that, no justice. Just the cold reality that some people can ruin lives and walk away untouched. I think about that often. I think about how we've built a world where anyone with a phone can become judge, jury, and executioner, where context is optional and consequences are permanent, where the loudest voices win, even when they're wrong. Henrik once told me he didn't blame individuals. He blamed the system, the algorithms that reward outrage, the platforms that prioritize engagement over truth, the culture that has taught us to react first and think later. I think he's right. But I also think we're all part of that system. We all feed it, every time we share without questioning, every time we judge without knowing, every time we choose the easy comfort of certainty over the hard work of nuance. Lotta is playing in the next room right now. I can hear her laughing, singing a song she learned at daycare. She's safe. She's happy. She's untouched by the darkness that her innocence once created. And I'm grateful for that. But I also know that one day, she'll grow up in this world. This fast, loud, unforgiving world. And I desperately hope, that by the time she does, we've learned to be a little kinder, a little slower, a little more careful with each other's lives. I don't know if we will, but I have to hope. Because what's the alternative? Henrik messaged me this morning. Just 3 words. Still here. Still trying. I sent back the same. Because that's all we can do. Keep trying. Keep fighting. Keep hoping that truth, even when it's slow and quiet, will eventually find its way through the noise. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone sees a video, they'll pause. They'll ask a question. They'll remember that behind every screen, every clip, every viral moment, there's a real person. A life. A story that's more complicated than 10 seconds can capture. Maybe they'll remember Henrik. And maybe that will be enough to make them wait. Because in a world that moves this fast, waiting might be the most revolutionary thing we can do. What will you do the next time you see something that makes you certain you know the truth? I've told you this story not because it has a happy ending, but because it has an honest one. Henrik is alive. He's surviving. But he's not the same person he was before that video. None of us are. The truth came out eventually, yes, but it came out quietly, to a world that had already moved on to its next target. The apologies, when they came, were whispered. The outrage that destroyed him had been shouted from every corner of the internet. That imbalance will never be corrected. There are moments when I wonder if we did the right thing by fighting back. Maybe Henrik would have been safer if he'd just disappeared, changed his name, started over somewhere far away where no one would ever connect him to that video. Maybe fighting for the truth only prolonged his suffering. But then I remember what he told me during that interview with Inaki. If my story makes even one person stop and think, it was worth it. I want to believe him. I want to believe that something good can come from something so painful. But I also know that belief isn't enough. We need action. We need to build a world where truth isn't drowned out by speed, where compassion isn't abandoned for clicks, where people are given the benefit of doubt before they're given a death sentence. I look at my daughter sometimes and wonder what kind of world she'll inherit. Will it be one where kindness is safe, where innocence is protected, where a child's kiss is just a child's kiss and nothing more? Or will it be one where every moment is a potential weapon, where every interaction is a risk, where fear has replaced trust as the default setting? I don't have the answers. I don't know how to fix a system that feels broken at its core, but I do know this. It starts with each of us. It starts with the decision to pause before we share, to question before we judge, to remember that behind every viral moment, there's a human being whose life can be changed forever by what we choose to do next. Henrik is still here, still trying, and so am I. We carry our scars, but we keep moving forward because what else is there to do? We tell our story, hoping it will matter, hoping it will make a difference, hoping that somewhere, someone will hear it and choose differently the next time they're faced with a video, a story, a narrative that feels too easy, too certain, too perfectly designed to make them angry. Today, when I think about that morning in the courtyard, I don't see the video. I see Lotta running through the grass. I see Henrik smiling. I see Amara laughing. I see a moment of pure, uncomplicated human connection. The kind that used to define us before we let technology rewrite the rules. And I mourn for the world that couldn't see it too. But I also hope. I hope that one day we'll learn, that we'll slow down, that we'll choose truth over speed, compassion over outrage, understanding over certainty. I hope that Henrik's story, and stories like his, will be the last of their kind, that will build something better, something kinder, something that remembers that we're all just people, trying our best, making mistakes, deserving of grace. I have to hope. Because without hope, what's left? Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If it touched you, or made you think about life in a different way, don't keep it just for yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear this too. And if you truly want to support this channel, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading what you have to say. And finally, if you really enjoyed it and want to help keep these stories alive, consider buying me a simple coffee on Ko-fi. Even the smallest gesture makes a big difference and helps us bring more stories like this to you. Thank you, and see you in the next one.